the main focus on all of our IEPs, goal writing, is that they had to be compliant with the state and all that. So there's been a lot of emphasis on that. We'll talk a little bit about the format of SMART goal writing, and then I have got a ton of ideas, samples of goals that I have had over the years and that you are certainly welcome to take and tweak. I was lucky that Wayne Township District had access to the Goal Bank, the Goal Book app, which has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of goals for every subject area, every behavioral area, and whatnot. So I have saved many of those, the ones that I used, and have put them in here today for your use later. So real briefly, who I am. Again, I'm Judy Kane. I just retired on June 4th after 36 years of teaching deaf and hard of hearing students. Have worked mainly secondary, high school, all except for 2 years at the very beginning of elementary, IC. I have mad respect for all of you who work in elementary. No, not for me. Retired from Wayne Township. Again, like I said, huge emphasis on professional development, and goal writing, IEPs is a priority. So yeah, that's who I am. All right, so I'm going to close the chat because I can't follow it. Here are the components in IEP for writing a goal. I never realized how many different parts there were until I outlined it. I mean, you know, you're used to just typing in the goals and writing them and whatnot, but when you sit out and look at each one specifically, it's a lot. So anyway, we're going to touch on each one of these as we go through the process today. So the goal title is, what is the area of learning? Is it reading comprehension? Is it writing? Is it behavior, advocacy? Is it listening? Is it speech? What area is this goal? And that's just a brief, you know, little blurb about that. Then the present levels. This, I always got input from classroom teachers and from interpreters, from their progress monitoring reports, from their grade books, you know, wherever you can garner information from. If you had data collection sheets, anything like that, as much information as you can get to show where this student currently is for this goal area is good. So the more you can get, the better. And then the standards. One of the nice things in IEP is that there are standards banks that you can choose from. So we always had to pick at least 2, 3. I mean, you can have more, but at least a couple to align with whatever the goal is that you want to work on. And then the present level. One thing that we got training on this past year is focusing on trauma-informed writing, student-driven writing. So here is an example of what someone might have written. Johnny's attention-seeking behavior results in frequently interrupting the teacher. That doesn't necessarily give you a lot of information. So here are 2 other options that rewording that just a little bit gives a lot better picture of what's going on with Johnny. Johnny frequently seeks regulatory assistance through maladaptive behavior. Or Johnny relies on direct attention from the teacher to help regulate during instruction. So it's kind of defining that. What does that interrupting look like? So anytime you can be much more specific on what is actually happening with the student or where the student is in whatever this area is, the better you'll be able to write a goal. And two, someone else picking up the IEP and looking at the goal, they'll have a much clearer understanding of just where Johnny is functioning. Here is another example of one that's not as clear. Johnny avoids the demands of activities he finds demanding through resistance and withdrawal. So he just shuts down, basically. Rewritten can sound like Johnny becomes overwhelmed by demanding activities and seeks to regulate frustration with resistance or withdrawal. So that kind of explains why he's doing what he's doing, and it gives a little more clear picture. Or we can say Johnny regulates frustration and feelings of being overwhelmed through withdrawal. So as you go back in the fall or summer, depending on when you start school, and you're rewriting new goals for the following year, kind of look at those present levels and see if they are just that real general kind of description, or if you can drill down and get to a little bit more specific statement on why, what's driving it, or what specifically is going on. And then we have specifically designed instruction. This was an area that Wayne Township really hit in the last couple of years, because a lot of times, and I was absolutely guilty of this myself, I would write what the student would be doing. Well, that's not what specifically designed instruction is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, what does the teacher do? So examples are, well, things to ask yourself. What are the students' barriers to learning at the expected level that we want them to learn at? What does the adult need to do to help the student reach this goal? And what strategies can the adult use to help accomplish this goal? So this is all teacher-driven, teacher-focused, not student-focused, which when we learned that a couple years ago, is like, whoa, that's brand new for me. So I don't know if it's brand new for you as well, but it sure was for me. And here are some examples. Guided practice for listening strategies. Teacher is guiding that practice. Scaffolded instruction. Visual, written, verbal, physical, picture prompts and cues. Modeling. Instruction of whatever the strategy or steps would be. Explicit instruction on how to use various tools like graphic organizers. Multisensory teaching strategies. Direct instruction in computation. Provide a visual schedule if you've got a student who needs that visual support for something. And portable. This needs to be something portable so that this IEP, this goal, can go from the teacher who wrote it to another professional who can then implement this IEP easily without having I don't have that program, or I don't have that equipment, or whatever. It needs to be something portable. Okay, these are things that specifically designed instruction are not, and full disclosure, things that I may have put in former IEPs in the past. It's not your LRE replacement. It doesn't belong, this general education classroom. That's not part of the designed instruction. It is not what the student does. And it doesn't restate the standards. It doesn't name a program or a specific piece of equipment. It's not driven by schedules or programs. Does not promote dependence. It doesn't presume that you're incompetent or the student is incompetent. It's not tied to a name brand and it is not tied to a specific person. Again, it needs to be portable so it can move from professional to professional to be able to work on this. Okay. And I'm assuming if we have questions my chat is not open, so I can't tell if there's questions. So Alicia, if there's questions that pop up, just break in and let me know, okay, please?
Will do.
All right, so supplementary aids and services, these are things that the student does use then. Visual prompts, self-monitoring checklists, calming strategies, graphic organizers, prompting and cues. That was often one that I think in the past I put in the specific designed instruction was prompting, not necessarily. Recorded materials, study guides, magnifiers, calculators, all these things are supplemental aids that a student can use to work towards whatever the goal is that they have. Okay, I'll let you have a second to finish that list. I didn't read them all to you. And you should have this PowerPoint, I think, or you will have the PowerPoint. Okay. So now the next couple pieces of the writing the goal process are you need to address what area this goal has been designed to support. And you have to check one or you don't get the green check mark on your goal page. It's either employment skills, education and training, or independent living. And most of the time, employment and education are appropriate for those because pretty much anything you do as education will have an impact on employment ability. So I usually just check both of those as a default. And then how will you measure progress? Can be observation, can be written work, oral work, data collection, teacher reports, assessments, informal or formal. And it can be one, multiple, all of those, or another way that you have come up with. But these are just the really common ways, I think. And then progress monitoring. We have been, in Wayne Township, has been on a big push to use the single point evaluation or monitoring, which is probably in reality the easiest to do once you get it set up. Or you can use descriptive where it's more anecdotal. And so either one of those, I mean, there's more, but those are the two most common ways. And then the progress monitoring assessment, you can use permanent products like tests, checklists, any data pieces, interviews, whichever. You can use charts. You can use a rubric that you have developed or define within the IEP or others. These are some common ones, and there are others, but and then what subject area? Generally, what is it? Reading? Is it math? Is it social skills? What general subject area are you talking about here? And then to set up the criteria for progress monitoring, there needs to be steps. Like if you're talking about, let's say, advocacy, one step could be student does not know the word or definition. Next up, student knows the word and can define it. Next up, student uses advocacy less than half of the day. Step up, student advocates more than half of the day. Student advocates 100% independently. So those could be steps. So that's just an example. And depending on what it is that you're defining, you know, just make some steps to see that a student can clearly progress up that. And oftentimes it's set with percentages or 1 out of, 2 out of, or whatever. And then when you build that graph, if you're doing the 1 point, it will set a graph for you. You start with where the student currently is, that initial value, and that date of initial, and then you set whatever the goal target is, that value and the date that you expect the student to be able to reach that. Usually it's that 1 year time frame that is written on the IEP. And then how often are you going to collect information? Typically that's every 9 weeks, and that's what's reported on the progress monitoring reports every 9 weeks. You can also have a metric or rubric or whatever to measure in there. All right, so the goal statement, I'm sure everybody has heard SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, results-based, and time-bound. So, and the ones that I have at the end of this PowerPoint are all written as SMART goals. So you can just take and tweak however you need to for those. Here are some examples of, and I got this from Indiana University Center of Community Living and Careers. So the condition would be, given any writing opportunity, Haley will write with correct spelling, legibility, capitalization, and punctuation. That's the target behavior. And the criteria, 4 out of 5 trials with 80% accuracy. So that's a simple framework to get your SMART goal in: the condition, target behavior, and criteria. Another one, when shown a flashcard of the functional words, Hannah will verbally identify the word 75 out of 100 words in 3 out of 4 trials. So she's got to get 75 words, but she's got 4 chances to get it to happen. Okay? And I'll let you read that last one after reading a passage in 7th grade. Okay. I saw this from Rebecca Bahan. She got this from somewhere, I forget where she got it, but it's another way that you can write goals. And this one was particularly color-coded, which made it for me easier to follow. I'm a visual learner, so I like the colors. But first you state the action that the student will take, the target behavior. Okay, Johnny will increase ability to self-advocate consistently. Then you describe the area of focus. When is this going to be taking place? During each class, in a situation where he is not sure what to do. And why are you doing this? To help him become more independent and successful. And what activities are needed to help, by knowing when he needs them, needs help, and then asking the teacher. So this is just another framework, an option that you could use. It's not the end all be all, it's just another option, which is what I was trying to give you, as many options and resources as possible. So here's another written goal in that same framework. Johnny will increase his ability to self-advocate for his listening needs in the classroom from an introduced level to a demonstrated level on the attached rubric by August of 2020, to allow him to be more independent and confident in classroom settings. So when given the direct support, consultation, and prompting when needed, and evidenced by self-selecting an optimal seat for listening by asking questions for clarification, by seeking help when needed, and using his hearing assistive technology. So that goal, I think, is extremely detailed and clear, as long as you see the attached rubric. So again, another possible framework to use when you're writing goals. So there's also goals for transition in a secondary IEP. Once a child reaches age 14, we start seeing the transition goals. So these have to be measurable post-secondary and are geared towards employment and independent living, and depending, maybe education if they're going on to further training. They need to be long range. They need to be based on data, their transition surveys, their interviews, their interests. They need to begin with an I statement. I will do blah, blah, blah. And they need to be attainable in a year. So don't make them so broad that it's impossible to attain. Okay. Here are compliant, which will get you a check on the indicator 13 page, I think it is, and quality, which are better. Okay. I'll get a job in my area of interest. Well, I don't know what area that is, but if you put a job in the medical field, that's a little bit more specific. Okay. I will get on the job training versus I will get on the job training from an employer to be a nurse's aide. I will enroll in college versus I will go to Ivy Tech and study nursing. I will work indoors with low lighting. I will use my visual schedule to complete my work routine. So you can see the difference in wording is between it's okay versus it's so much better and so much more quality. Here are some other ones for independent living. After high school, I will purchase items at the grocery store using the next dollar strategy. So $1 up. If it's $6.29, I'll give them $7. The next dollar up. After high school, I will prepare lunch with hand-over-hand support. I will independently ride the city bus. I will take tennis lessons at the YMCA. I will maintain my friendships by texting, calling, or emailing. So these are all independent living possible goals that a student may have. Okay, I've got 15 minutes left in my session, so I'm going to scroll through some of these samples. And again, you should have the PowerPoint and or the handout, which is made from the PowerPoint. So I forget which one was posted, but these are all there. So you've got some writing examples, and I'll just let you read some of these. Any of the in parentheses are the areas where you change it. So by the date, you put whatever date it is. The name, you put the student's name in. If you want them to write a 5-sentence paragraph, leave it 5. If you want them 3 or 10 or whatever it is, and then whatever your 5 out of 5, 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5, 6 out of 10, whatever that is, you can adjust those. Okay. Here's another writing, sensory details with the 5 sentences, metaphors, and similes. Precise language, vocabulary, and the one thing, if you have access to Goal Book, is they have the general goal, and then they have, if the student needs a little bit more support for moderate level, or if they need a lot of support, then it's explained a little bit differently with a lot more assistive instruction that the teacher would do. Right, an organized composition. Let me get down to vocabulary, determining meaning of words that you don't know from the tone. Explain a topic using specific vocabulary. Draw meaning from those unfamiliar words using your context clues. Using parts of words to determine the meaning, suffixes, root words, those kinds of things. Let me go down to reading goals. Using text evidence to justify your opinion or your answer. Summarizing. Point of view. Let's see. Organization. Describe how you feel right now. This organizational goal I used a lot because it seems like so many deaf and hard kids that I've worked with just weren't organized. They didn't know how to organize themselves. So this was a very a goal that really matched what they needed. Completion of work. And I've had other teachers and professionals ask, you know, there are some kids who are on grade level who are not deficient in any of those academic areas, but yet you still need a goal for them in their IEP. So these kinds of things, the organization, the advocacy, the work completion, those are kind of goals that you can put in there that are not as difficult for kids to attain, and may really help them be successful, especially if they are on grade level. They just might not be able to do some of these soft skill type things. Responding appropriately, asking for help, helping others, accepting help from others, completing assignments, college searches. This is a real common one, especially for sophomores, juniors, seniors. Identifying possible colleges, registering for the standardized exams, SAT, PSAT, all of those, or the ASVAB, possibly if they want to go military, for your academic plan as 8th graders or freshmen to fill out that projected where do I want to be. More college search, interview skills. A lot of times kids need those interview skills. Social emotional, do they initiate interaction or do they just sit there like a wallflower? Okay. Sustain a conversation. Adjust to unexpected changes. That's a big one for a lot of kids. They're used to the routine and then something messes up the routine and I don't know what to do with that. So positive self-expression. Responding to bullying, responding respectfully to adults, self-regulation, calming strategies. Whoop, yeah. So those are the goals that I have included. I'm going to stop share and see if anybody has questions. I've got about 10 minutes. If anybody has questions on anything, I will open that up before I turn it over to Susan. Does anybody? If not, then we can hop over to Susan. Well, thank you all for your time and attention. And I hope you have the ability to use some of this in your classrooms, in your goal writing. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
Susan, you're on.
Okay, thank you, Judy. I'm going to try to share my screen. So give me a few minutes here. Okay. Does that look okay? Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. My background in working with deaf and hard of hearing children, I got started some years ago, probably about 20 years ago, working on the cochlear implant team at the Indiana University School of Medicine, and I was doing assessments for about 11 years, collecting data on children with cochlear implants and looking at the benefit that they received from their implants in terms of speech perception, speech production, and language. And after that, I took some time off and started working after a couple years of raising children at St. Joseph Institute for the Deaf, where I'm the lead speech language pathologist. I'm at St. Joseph 3 days a week, and then my services are contracted through the Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Education, where I do listening and spoken language assessments. So today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about goal writing, but my emphasis is on building auditory skills in children who, deaf and hard of hearing children who are pursuing listening and spoken language, because that's my area of specialty. And when I sit in on case conferences, a lot of times at the, as we're drafting the IEP, I'll see a goal about self-advocacy, about the child being able to report when the battery is dead on their amplification device, or maybe identifying the Ling 6 sounds, but I don't really see a lot of other auditory goals in the IEP, and building children's auditory skills is so fundamental when we're trying to get them to master spoken language. So some of the considerations that I have when developing listening and spoken language IEP goals is that we really want to make sure that children are using their amplification all waking hours. Carol Flexer has reported that the ear is the doorway to the brain for sound. And so it's of utmost importance that children are wearing their hearing aids or cochlear implants or remote microphones 10 to 12 hours a day. And this is important because the brain needs to make neural connections in order to meaningfully interpret the auditory information conveyed via their hearing technology. Another important consideration for deaf and hard of hearing children who are pursuing listening and spoken language is that the child has optimal access to frequencies across the speech sound spectrum. In other words, Amy Robbins has reported that deaf and hard of hearing children need to have sufficient, not necessarily perfect, but sufficient access to vowels, consonants, and suprasegmental patterns that make up language. For example, if a child has a severe to profound hearing loss and receives limited benefit from conventional amplification, a child may be better off receiving a cochlear implant in order to achieve access to the frequencies that are so important to developing spoken language. Another important consideration when developing IEP goals is that we look at where does a child fall in their remediation. Are they on the oral habilitation track, or are they on more of a rehabilitation track for achieving listening and spoken language? Children who are in the oral habilitation track are those children that are developing skills in synchrony and are developing skills similar in rate and fashion to their typical hearing peers, but need some intervention. We expect them to close the gap between their language age and their chronological age so that their spoken language skills will be commensurate to their typical hearing peers. Children who are more on the rehabilitation track have a more significant gap or delay in their language skills compared to their typical hearing peers. And so they may need more intensive training than those on the oral habilitation track. Sometimes children who start out in the rehabilitation track will move to a habilitation track, so it's not necessarily static. So that's why it's important that we examine the rate of acquisition of skills through frequent progress monitoring, and that will help us identify what IEP goals we should be addressing. For example, there are some children who receive a cochlear implant, and after they've had their device for a couple of years, they have a more accelerated rate of language acquisition, and we kind of call that their catch-up year. So maybe we want to make their goals a little bit more intense and rigorous for the next coming year. So those are some variables or considerations that are always in the back of my mind when I'm thinking about developing IEP goals for a specific child. We won't talk much about assessments but assessments do play an important role in finding out where a child's strengths and challenges are, and that helps us identify what goals we want to work on. Some of the resources that I like to look at are the Auditory Learning Guide from Beth Walker, which was developed in 2009. I also use the Cottage Acquisition Scales for Listening, Language, and Speech from the Sunshine Cottage School for Deaf Children. Track a Listening Child from Cochlear Corporation. And then there are also some milestones, developmental milestones, birth to 8 years from Hearing First. I don't use one guide over another. I kind of have an eclectic approach. So there are certain things about each one of these guides that I like. Some of the speech perception measures that were used with younger children, sometimes we get information through functional parent report questionnaires by asking parents questions about their child's listening skills in everyday listening contexts at home. So we may use the It Mays or Little Ears or the Peach. And then I also like to look at objective speech perception measures such as the early speech early speech perception test, the Mr. Potato Head task. I like to work with and consult with audiologists who are administering the Whippy and the new chips, and some other open set word measures such as the MLNT, LNT, PBKs, and common phrases. So when we're looking at auditory skill development, there's a lot of different hierarchies that are used, but one of the most simplest constructs is one that was developed by Norm Erber in 1982 and has continued to be frequently used. This hierarchy, the most basic level or the beginning level is detection, and that's simply being able to tell the presence versus absence of sound. And so children can demonstrate that by performing a conditioned response. Maybe they will point to their ear and say, I hear it. If it's an infant, maybe we're looking at detection skills by looking at their swallowing reflex when sound is presented. The next highest level is discrimination, and that's basically looking at a child's ability to determine if two sounds or two stimuli sound the same or different. This is used more as a remediation skill than actual writing an IEP goal for discrimination. So, for example, when we go to the next level, identification, we're looking at whether a child can identify a word. And the responses for identification would be simply a child labeling a sound, pointing to a picture, picking an object from a group of objects. Those would be all identification type tasks. But if I saw a child having difficulty maybe hearing the difference between minimal pair words on an identification task, let's say a child's having difficulty and showing some confusion with nasal consonants M and N, I might want to do a task where I'm asking them to tell me if two words sound the same or different. So I might present, meat as a protein meat, and neat as in your room is neat. I might present those two words and say, do those two words sound the same or different to you? And then the highest level of auditory skill development is comprehension. And at the comprehension level, the child must understand the meaning of acoustic messages. And this is usually by reference to his or her knowledge of language. So a child cannot simply repeat the word that was presented, but must show some other response that differs from the content of the stimulus. For example, the child would have to answer a question, follow commands. Maybe the child would have to write the opposite of a word that was presented. So just to give another example of the difference between identification and comprehension, if I asked a child, what is your name? And the child responded, what is your name? That's an example of identification. This child is simply repeating what I said. But if I ask another child, what is your name? And the child responded, Johnny, then that is an example of comprehension. So just to kind of go back a little bit, while this is a hierarchy of skills starting from detection to comprehension, sometimes as we're working with a child, we may be working on identification and have to move back down to discrimination, or vice versa. We're working on comprehension and the child is struggling with the task. We may have to move that down to identification. So this slide just shows you some examples of toys or materials that you could use when working on developing a conditioned response with a child who has just received hearing aids or cochlear implants. When working on detection, I'm usually working with children who are preschool age, so we're really moving toward wanting to get them to be able to demonstrate a conditioned response by putting a block in a bucket or a piece in a puzzle. And the stimuli that we're using, we want to start with really speech and not work so much on environmental sounds during conditioned response tasks. So maybe I will, I'll beep, 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 and the child has to put a block in a bucket. I'm being very careful as I'm doing these to make sure that I vary the pause time between presentation of one speech stimulus to the next, so that I can try to extinguish any false positive behaviors that the child might be demonstrating. And I want to work on this conditioned response, even though they may get 10 out of 10 trials correct. I still am going to continue to work on this a little bit in each of my therapy sessions so that it's almost overlearned, so that the child will be able to generalize those responses at their audiology appointment and will be able to get a good audiogram and also be able to have good attention during programming and setting up new maps with their cochlear implant or hearing aid. So when we look at those two very basic fundamental skills for developing audition in children working on their listening and spoken language, we want to think about maybe goals that address wear time and detection. And so if you work in at St. Joseph, we have the luxury of having a consulting audiologist who has equipment to look at daily use, the average daily use for children with cochlear implants, and we can track that weekly. But I realize that others don't maybe have that luxury in their building. So one of the things that we also do is we make sure that parents are motivated in developing listening and spoken language. So oftentimes they will give us consent to consult with their child's audiologist directly. And so whenever the child is seen by their audiologist and we get the report, then we have some sort of ability to see what the average use time is that the child is wearing their amplification each day. So one of the goals might be Sophia will consistently wear her bilateral cochlear implants for an average of 10 to 12 hours each day based on data logging over 2 audiological appointments. Or if we were working on detection, maybe it would be Charlie will consistently perform a conditioned response in structured listening tasks across 3 data days and in the booth at his scheduled audiology appointment. So these are just 2 examples. It's hard to come up with an approach that will work for every single child, but as you think about individual children on your caseload, you may be able to modify these goals to fit that particular child. Another goal that is frequently seen in the beginning on children's IEPs is identification of the Ling 6 sound tests. And one of the reasons why the Ling 6 sound test is really important is because it's a tool for daily diagnostics. We can check to see if amplification is functioning properly for the child, particularly those children who are maybe bilaterally amplified. They may not be reporting when their battery dies in one of their devices because they're relying on hearing for the device where the battery is still working. We can also monitor hearing stability over time. There are some children who have a progressive loss, and so we're looking at do we see any sort of decline in their hearing thresholds over time. And if we're consistently doing the Ling 6 sound test, then we would be able to maybe identify earlier when there might be some sort of decrease in hearing and a return to the audiologist is needed. A final consideration when doing the Ling 6 sound test is we need to perform distance lings to obtain the true threshold. So what is the furthest distance in which the child can identify all 6 Ling sounds? And so we would want to be able to find that out because that will help us know if there's any change in hearing stability over time. So when looking at the Ling 6 sounds, there's 6 different sounds, 3 vowels and 3 consonants. And these vowels and consonants were chosen because they span the frequency in which English occurs. So they span the speech sound spectrum. And so we have ah, e, oo, sh, s, and Here you'll see a slide where one of our speech language pathologists, Kelsey, is working with a bilaterally implanted child, being able to identify the 6 Ling sounds, and they're using picture cards, and the child is picking up a token on the card where Kelsey has presented one of the Ling sounds. Given that the Ling 6 sounds is a closed set test and there are only 6 sounds, in order to reduce the child's ability to use process of elimination, I usually administer the Ling 6 sounds, some of those sounds more than once, to make sure that they're not guessing or using process of elimination. And sometimes I will look to see how confident that child is as a listener when performing this test. And I may repeat the Ling 6 sounds 3 times, and see if their answer changes. So I'm trying to sabotage them. And here is one of our other speech language pathologists at St. Joseph administering the Ling 6 sounds. And she's using an acoustic hoop to provide these sounds through listening alone. And this child is bilaterally implanted, and you'll notice on the slide that the coil on one of his implants is off, so that she is able to check each individual implant and ear to make sure that his hearing is stable and that his devices are working properly. So a potential goal for addressing the Ling 6 sound test is that with each individual hearing aid, Henry will identify the Ling 6 sounds from varying distances of 3 feet, 6 feet, 9 feet, and 12 feet with 100% accuracy across 3 data days. It's important to mention that this is just one goal. Children with bilateral cochlear implants or hearing aids can actually hear much further than 12 feet. So you're really working to find where that true threshold is. So we have some bilateral cochlear implant users who are being able to identify all 6 of the Ling sounds at 20 feet or further. And just want to make a comment that you're going to adjust that goal based on the child's performance on your caseload. After you find where their true threshold is and they're being able to identify the Ling 6 sounds from a distance, then sometimes this goal is moved more to an accommodation than to an actual IEP goal. Another common goal that we see on children who are beginning listeners with their amplification is we're looking at learning to listen sounds. And learning to listen sounds and associated objects or actions are actually hallmarks of teaching spoken language through listening. These sounds were chosen by auditory verbal practitioners because they are easy to hear for most babies wearing hearing devices, and they follow normal language development. They also include beginning sounds, phrases, and commands that are commonly spoken in early infant and child routines. So learning to listen sounds are rich in suprasegmental features of speech. They vary by duration, intensity, and pitch. And this next slide shows some of the learning to listen sounds that are out there. So they're not just simply onomatopoeia words, but they're actually specific sounds associated with objects that range in various suprasegmental features. So on this slide, you'll see airplane, ah, or duck, quack, quack, or maybe the cow, moo, or a horse, which is neigh. Another way that we can develop suprasegmental speech features, perception of those features in children who are deaf and hard of hearing is by using songs and nursery rhymes. You can contrast songs that vary in melody and rhythm. Children can show identification of the songs by picking a prop or performing a corresponding motion associated with the song. An added benefit of music is that it crosses domains and benefits deaf and hard of hearing children by improving their articulation, suprasegmental accuracy, language development, social skills, and turn-taking skills, to name a few other areas. And then another way that we can work on perception of suprasegmental features is by having a child be able to identify different classroom routines that are presented through songs. So maybe we have an activity in our therapy room where I have a basket and small little toys, and I contrast that with the toy sink. And so I may sing the cleanup song. Clean up, everybody, everywhere, clean up, clean up. And when the child hears that song, they demonstrate that they have identified it by putting the toys in the basket. And I contrast that with, you know, wash your hands. And when the child hears that song, maybe they go to the toy sink and pretend that they're washing their hands. So those are some different ways to work on identification, looking at perception of suprasegmental features. So what are some goals that we can write that are working on perception of suprasegmental speech features? Maybe we will want to work on learning to listen sounds. So we could write, through listening alone, David will perceive and produce 10 to 15 learning to listen sounds that span a range of segmental and suprasegmental features with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Or if we want to work on familiar songs, Gabby will identify 3 to 5 familiar songs through audition alone by performing a corresponding movements or selecting a prop associated with a song with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Continuing on with some other examples, Thomas will use auditory closure to sing repetitive words or phrases when presented familiar songs in the auditory only condition with 80% accuracy and 4 out of 5 opportunities. Using bilateral hearing aids, Kylie will follow routine classroom commands that are contrasted on the basis of suprasegmental features with 80% accuracy and 4 out of 5 opportunities. Looking at identification, we have here a picture of a language activity using a file folder. And if the child is having to look at different clothing items to put on different people, if I ask him to just find one of the clothing items, like find the red skirt, that would be an identification task. But if I'm asking him to follow more of a direction with this activity, put the red skirt on the girl with the blonde hair, then that would be more of a comprehension task. So let's look at some goals that we might have for addressing identification. I think the Auditory Learning Guide has a lot of, it is a good resource for coming up for word identification tasks. So one example might be using a variety of words differing by vowel and consonant features. Molly will demonstrate closed set word recognition with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. So maybe Molly has 4 objects, common objects in front of her, like a apple, a banana, a candy, and a baseball, and then you say apple. Molly has to identify by picking the apple from the group that she has identified that word. Another example might be using his hearing aids. Sam will identify words in which the vowel and initial consonants are identical, but the final consonants differ by place of articulation. For example, comb versus coat, with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. So looking at the highest level of auditory skill development, when we look at comprehension, we might be looking at things such as Catherine will comprehend words presented in an open set through listening alone and quiet, and in noisy environments with 80% accuracy across 3 data days. So comprehending the words, Catherine has to do something else besides just repeat the words. Maybe she has to define the word. So if I'm doing like the lexical neighborhood test and I'm using acoustic hoop and I say the word 6, Catherine then has to say 6 and then tell me what that is. Oh, 6, that's a number. Then we would say that that was she was showing comprehension. Another comprehension goal might be Danny will answer simple WH questions following an auditory only presentation of a short story. That's 3 to 5 sentences in length with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Or Nick will increase his auditory memory skills by demonstrating understanding of 2 to 3 critical elements by manipulating objects or by following commands with 80% accuracy in 8 out of 10 trials. Or using her auditory feedback loop, Amy will follow directions containing inclusion, exclusion, and temporal concepts with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Using his cochlear implants, Alex will listen and respond to questions, commands, and directions in the presence of background noise with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. So integrating auditory skills, we can also integrate them into other areas of development. So just to give you some examples, when we're looking at a child's articulation, we know that there's a connection between their speech production and their speech perception skills. that children's speech production, they often, what they say is what they hear. So when I'm looking at the types of errors that they are making, I can kind of tell what they are hearing through their hearing aids and cochlear implants. I can also kind of tell if they're not wearing their devices, just if their progress isn't changing in the timeline that it should be, based on the access that they have with their amplification. So a way to make your articulation goals more auditory based is if you include the word perceive. Johnny will perceive and produce early developing consonants such as P, B, T, D, K, and G in the initial position of words with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Looking at language, we can also look at those parts of speech that are less salient to deaf and hard of hearing children. So when we're looking at prepositions, when we look at those beginning prepositions in, on, and under, those prepositions, when they're embedded in a sentence, sound very similar. So we might want to think about looking at the auditory component in developing acquisition of prepositions. Or sometimes children have difficulty perceiving the difference between the pronouns he and she. Amy Robbins has often reported on the difficulty of deaf and hard of hearing children producing the final consonants in words because they're less salient. We don't stress them as often, and they're probably considered the most subtle or the most fragile subskill of language development. Sorry about that. Most fragile subskill of language development in deaf and hard of hearing children, just because we just do not produce them very clearly when we're talking in conversation. So the importance of working on grammatical morphemes and contractions and developing IEP goals for children in those areas. Academics is another area that might need to be considered when looking at audition. When we look at ordinals and place value, a lot of times they end with a high frequency sound such as TH when we say 4th, 5th, 6th, or 100th. We're looking at science vocabulary. Sometimes they're multisyllabic words, and deaf and hard of hearing children may be deleting or omitting unstressed syllables in the vocabulary. Spelling words, being able to hear the difference between words that are rhyming words and differ by only one consonant. And finally, literacy skills, where we're looking at phonological awareness. Can the child be clap syllables? Can they do onset rhyme activities? Or are they having difficulty perceiving the difference between consonants and phonemes? Can the child identify the first and last sound in a word? Or can they do word play activities? So I'd like to stop my presentation here and open up if there are any questions regarding anything that Judy presented or I have presented so far.
You do have a question in the chat box, so let me read it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Renee Hack asked, have you ever referred a family to use ASL versus spoken English after they have not made adequate progress on goals over a number of years?
Absolutely. It's always a difficult conversation to have, but if the initial slide where we're doing progress monitoring and looking at how the rate of a child's skills are developing in terms of acquiring spoken language, the goal is really for that child to be able to close the gap so that they can be competitive in a mainstream classroom. Children who receive cochlear implants are implanted at a really young age, and sometimes we don't know if there are any other additional disabilities on top of hearing loss. And so I feel a real that it's very important that we're honest with the families, and that the goal is for the child to develop communication competency and communication, or communication competency, and whether that be through listening and spoken language, or we need to go to a different methodology. So I absolutely have had to counsel families to using something other than just strictly listening and spoken language, whether that be an augmentative communication device, or moving toward American Sign Language or total communication. That was a very good point, so thank you for asking that question.
That's the only question that we have in the chat as of right now.
Okay. Judy, do you have anything to add? Since you ended your presentation a little early, do you have anything to add to yours?
I don't really. I think it was a nice combination, though, having just a more general thing about goals and then a specific with listening and spoken language. I think that was a nice complement. And we must have done a great job if nobody has questions. Maybe. Or they're just not there. I don't know. Maybe they're all asleep from lunch. Who knows?
They're just shy.
They're shy. Yeah, right.
I will say it's hard to do this virtually because you can't really read the reactions of the audience. And so, you know, I'm sure there are parts of this presentation that I may have been able to spend more time or less time on, but it's been a challenge on this end to try to gauge audience interest in specific areas of the talk.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yep.
All right, well, thank you, Susan and Judy. This concludes our session. Please complete the evaluation to receive your professional growth points, or RID IIC CEUs, and to be entered into a prize drawing at the end of the conference. The evaluation link can be found in Schedule or use the QR code on the screen. And I would like to apologize because I forgot to say the beginning code. It is SMART. So the beginning code is SMART. The ending code for RID IIC CEUs is GOALS. To leave this session, click the Leave Meeting button on the bottom of your screen, and please return to the main room for the prize drawing and closing announcements. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.